Well, we come to the place in the Garden of Eden story of the curse. And I have to say that it was a challenge for me to begin this video because there's so much going on, and the question of getting this all said in 20 minutes without talking either so fast you can't understand what I'm saying or having it go on too long was a challenge. So what I've decided to do is divide this up into two, and as we go, maybe three videos. And so let's start by looking where it is in our story, and then we'll see what the issues are we have to address and why we might not be able to do this in our usual 20 minutes or so. So here's where we are in the sequence of the chiasm. That's one way of mapping the story. We're down here in the B1 thing, and we didn't look, when we looked at the last one, at the parallel with the other side of the chiasm here. I'd like to do that now. With the B prime, you can see higher up where I've highlighted the B section. So in both places, God is the main actor, the man has a minor role, and the woman and the snake are passive, which of course is exactly the opposite of what we had just seen with the woman being active and the man being passive. And the theme, as we can see in both, is the relationship between humans and animals going from the ideal to the actual. Although it's more than that, this chart only conveys a little piece of that. Because what I'd also like us to see is this. We're going to explore a number of things here. One is in the plot. There's a drama going on here in these relationships between Yahweh God, the man, the woman, and the snake. And we're going to see simply at the plot level how Yahweh chooses to resolve this. Then there's the outcome. What is the effect of the curse itself? And for that matter, what does curse mean? And we'll look at that here today and see how the outcome is the prospect of patriarchy and agricultural struggle. Perhaps not what you learned in Sunday school is the outcome of the Garden of Eden story, which is one reason why we have to look at it in some great detail. And then there are a couple of other parts that we may get to this time or we may get to next time, which is how the entire story, but especially the curse part that we're seeing here, can be read as a satire on both the monarchy of Solomon in the question of the knowledge of good and evil, but also of the Babylonian Pneuma Elish and the question of agriculture and patriarchy and whether those are the divine order as we see in the Pneuma Elish or a curse, the opposite of the divine order as we see here in Genesis. And then finally, the historical question of what can we know, or what do the Genesis authors know, behind the story in the moment they're in. In other words, what might they have known, or what can we know differently about why the Pneuma Elish is not true about the origins of the city or the origins of agriculture. We have much more information now about human history in the long haul and the history of the earth in the long haul. So that will certainly be another video, and some of that is covered in the chapters in my book, Come Out My People, and the question of the city. So this will also overlap what we see in chapter 4 with Cain. And we'll see that in just a moment as we can see the sequence of what happens in the primeval history. So let's go to that now and look at the what the outcome of the curse would be before we go back and look at the plot in the story itself. So before the curse, the relationship with God was open and intimate. The Adam first, and then the Ish and the Isha were there and seemingly trusting God. There didn't seem to be any challenge. There certainly weren't hiding. And afterward, they're alienated and distant, as we see here, hiding and then kicked out of Eden. And then in the next chapter, Cain will be told will turn away from the face of Yahweh. And eventually in chapter 11, we'll see Nimrod building a city empire. And the phrase there is Lifnei Yahweh, in Yahweh's face. And we'll look at that, of what that might mean, whether that's got Yahweh's approval or is, as we hear it in English, a counterclaim, in your face, Yahweh, I'm going to build my own creation here. So also gender relationships. We saw in chapter 1, whether we think of that as a priestly author or simply the first chapter, that male and female were in the image and likeness of God equally. And then, of course, in our garden story, we've seen that the Ish and the Isha were naked and unashamed. But now they are ashamed of their nakedness, covered with fig trees, and that will lead to patriarchy here, as we'll see in this very passage. In terms of earth relationships, we saw in chapter 1 that humans were given authority to steward non-human creation using the verb rada, which would be very different than the verb for rule that we'll see in our passage today. And the Adam came from the Adamah, flowing with Dam, which was blood, and therefore the earth relationship with humans was deeply connected, earthlings with the earth, humans with the humus. But now, as we'll see, the Adam will fight with the Adamah for control. The sad break here between this identity of relationship with the Adam and the Adamah to a fight for control. And then in chapters 5 and 6, in setting up the flood, we'll see the narrator tells us that human corruption and violence have filled the earth. And after the flood, which is a failure, as we'll see, it doesn't change anything in these relationships. So God creates further alienation to prevent some of human damage to the earth, so the dread of humans is put on all other animals. And as we've seen between their time and ours, that hasn't helped too much, has it? And then finally, in the Tower of Babel story, we'll see how earth elements become materials for civilization. They had bitumen for mortar, and as we'll see there. And so things that were meant to be for the earth, starting with the fig tree and now going up to build civilization. As we move on, the food source originally was a gift that God said you can eat from all the trees except this one. And now we're going to see that food is going to be a struggle. Thorns and thistles, weeds in other words, will come forth and interfere with humans' ability to eat freely. The social order was radically shifted. So in the beginning, all humans were created equally in the divine image, and no humans were given authority of any kind to rule over each other. But now in this very passage, we're going to see not only gender patriarchy, but in the next chapter, we're going to see both Cain and his violent power over his brother his brother Abel, and Lamech over somebody who wounded him, whom he kills, the increasing violent power of men, in particular, over others. And that will lead to the systematic expression of that in hierarchical urban empire in Nimrod's creation in chapter 10. And then finally, where home is. So, of course, we've seen here that home was in God's garden, a place where God's footsteps can be heard, where all is provided, where everything is free. And that will move to either living in cities or seeking to avoid the violence and oppression of cities. So we'll see throughout the father-mother stories, the wife-sister stories, and the three generations from Abraham, Sarah, to Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, the struggle of people on the earth in relation to cities. So all those changes happen in these few verses and what follows after that. So as we prepare to move into our passage, just a couple more quick things to be looking at. We're going to see some more of these word plays we saw before last time, this closeness between a roam for naked and a room for crafty or sly. Here we're going to see a slightly different word for naked. It looks the same in the consonants, but the vowels are different, and you see it's in just in these three places. And that's closely related. It's not quite the same as the word for curse. And so we'll see that word play here. So let's get our Hebrew text up and let's begin to dive into this. So we're going to start off by looking at the issue of the drama and the characterization here. And as many people have noted, in the previous scene that we looked at, there's dialogue. God asks questions and the people respond. But now in this scene there is no dialogue. It's simply God speaking. And so what does that mean? It depends upon what we understand about God, both as a character in the story and about God beyond that. So let's look at a couple of quotes from scholars that I think are helpful here. Back to Dana Fuel and David Gunn here. So they say, a reader might notice that though God readily redirects his question from the man to the woman, the serpent's mouth he stops first with words and then with dust. For to the question, what is this that you have done, might not the serpent have said, you didn't tell them the whole truth, so I gave them the chance to choose for themselves. Or perhaps the servant might have asked the counter question, what is this that you have done? Why did you put that tree in the garden? Or, why did you allow me, serpent, to have an alternative voice? Or simply, why can you not stand for anyone to be like you? Instead, God moves to stop the cycle of blame from coming to rest on himself. Or to put it another way, he, like the humans, rushes to shift and fix the blame. Now, if we want to protect God from any kind of calumny from authors and things, that might be disturbing to us. But if we're simply readers who aren't trying to defend a pre-existing notion of God, then there's something to be said for their view here, that God sort of out-gods them and has a power they don't have. Let's look at it from another perspective from White here, who's very concerned in his writing about subjective and intersubjective relationships. Let's look at his second quote here because I think it's more immediately connected to what we're about here. So he says, the resulting order, quote, characterized by relations of humiliation, subordination, and relentless conflict, corresponds to the condition of life which Ortigues attributes to the domination of the imagination over consciousness. The full and immediate presence of visually derived objects in the imagination reveals to consciousness its own emptiness and ignites the flames of desire for the full presence of being which these specular images seem to possess. And if that seems like a heady thing to us, let's hear that a little more practically in his next quote. Humankind will experience the limits of their subjective existence not in the dignity of a divine word to them, but in the humiliating struggle with hostile animals, unequal social structures, the recalcitrance of nature, death, and the final elusiveness of utopia. Within the confines of these fateful limits, they will have an unlimited mode of knowledge, but this they will experience as a source of perpetual alienation from themselves, from God, and their fellow humans. In other words, what God is doing here is breaking up exactly what God tried to establish. Is that a proper behavior, like a parent preventing a child from engaging in further bad behavior? Or is it petulance from a God who's upset that these creatures aren't accepting the gift? Or something else? But there's no dialogue here, so we can't know, and there's certainly no sense of tone. So we have to just look at the specifics as we go and recognize that God is speaking, and whether the people are listening or not, we can't say, or whether the serpent, for that matter, is listening or not. So we note that the curses go in opposite order. First the serpent, then the woman, then the man. And well, there's a certain parallel in all of these we see with the phrase, all the days of your life, you see in verse 14. And then we'll see it again down here in verse 17, which applies to both women, all the days of your life. So to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. So, of course, this implies that the snake somehow was not on its belly before that. And, of course, the ancient audience knew, I'm sure better than we do, that snakes, of course, don't eat dirt. In this case, afar, the very same dry topsoil that the Adam was made out of, along with God's Ruach spirit, in verse 7 of chapter 2. So there's a connection there, but obviously not a connection to real life, as the audience would know. And why imagine that the snake was otherwise legged or armed, or had arms and legs but now can't use them? Why not the curse be that you will no longer speak and interrupt people? Why does going on the belly respond to the situation? Because we'll see that the woman and the man responds very directly to the situation here. And this seems less connected. But maybe the authors knew something we don't know about snakes and their relationships with human and agriculture. But obviously more important here is not the question of snakes, but the question of men and women. So let's look at this one here. As Phyllis Tribble notes, one of the first feminist authors to be engaging this story in her classic book, Texts of Terror, the distinctions between the animal world and the human world become oppositions. The hierarchy of harmony is now ruined. And this particular verse 15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel, as the other half of the curse to the snake. As my note here is, since the Christian writer Irenaeus in the 2nd century, Christian tradition has understood this as a prophecy about Jesus Christ and Mary. But there are many reasons against that, not least of which is the word for offspring. Seed here is a collective term, and so it's not referring to a specific person like Jesus. And Westermann makes some other technical elements. But another thing to add to that is simply the Genesis authors are not anticipating something in the far future. They're talking about the reality of their world in exile, as seen from the previous, back history before they were Israelites. So a couple details of this verse here. The word for enmity here is only here in Genesis. There are other words for opposition, but this is not it. There are several words in this passage that are either unique to this passage or rare. So there's this enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, between your seed, literally, and her seed. He will, notice the offspring are described as male here, will strike your head, or as cover. And the word note from my notes here can have various meanings, meaning to tread upon or crush, as we suggest here. Also can mean to crave or desire in a sexual way, as we see here in Genesis 4:7. The word here is the same root word. Is describing sin in relation to Cain, as the relationship here of the striking of the snake with your, the snake striking you, and you will strike at it. So we wouldn't notice that from the English. The word for heel here is an interesting one, Yaakov, which is Jacob. In fact, we'll see that there. So just as the offspring of the woman will, the offspring of the snake will strike at the heel of the people, we see here that Jacob is grabbing at Esau's heel. So isn't it curious that the authors here are suggesting that somehow Jacob is akin to the snake, and he'll be described not as a crafty man, but as a smooth man, but we'll get to that way later. It's a curious thing about the man whose name becomes Israel itself. So now on to the curse against the woman and the man, which is what we're really focusing on here. So, a number of things can be done to translate this verse, and this verse is so crucial that I want to bring up a range of translations so we can see that. I want to put this on the full screen so we can really see this large enough to make sense out of this. So, in the new RSV that I was just showing, we have, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for a husband. He shall rule over you. So, suggesting three things. More pain or pangs in childbearing. Does that mean childbirth? Does that mean in pregnancy? Or does that mean in having children, like raising children? So let's look at some others. The classic King James says, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. So that treats us as two different things. There'll be more sorrow and more conception, but it's not plural, so it's not clear exactly what that means. The New English here, the Net Bible, says, I will greatly increase your labor pains, reducing it to one thing and making it very specific to the process of actually giving birth. The New International, another evangelical one, as the New English is, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. Using childbearing like the New Revised Standard rather than labor pains, but referring to pains rather than pangs, and making the pains more severe rather than more of them. The common English has, I will make your pregnancy very painful. So suddenly it's gone from the labor pains being painful to the pregnancy being painful. The New American Revised Edition, which is one of the standard Catholic versions, says, I will intensify your toil in childbearing. Toil, painful, pangs, which is it? And the Message, which is more of a paraphrase, but a fun one, says, I'll multiply your pains in childbirth, in specifying childbirth, much like labor pains here in the New English. So that's the first part. And then the final part about is it patriarchy or not? So just going left to right, New International has rule over you. New English has dominate you, and these others have rule over you, except the Message has lorded over you. So all of those suggest patriarchy. So Carol Myers, who's one of the great feminist biblical scholars who we're going to be looking at repeatedly, but especially in this, renders it this way, and we'll go back and look at the details. So she says, I will greatly increase your toil, and note the important key word, Hebrew word, itzavon, and your pregnancies. So two things. Increase your toil, not pains and not pangs, and not childbirth, but just toil as one thing, and pregnancy is another. And your desire shall be for your man, and he shall rule over you. So we have a number of options there, and to make sense of any of those, of course, we have to look at the Hebrew and pay attention to these details, and there are a lot of details. So, to the woman he said, if we read this, this in first phrase, increase, greatly increase your pangs, is one of those doubled Hebrew words where the verb is used twice, or the adjective rather is used twice in this case to indicate what we might say as very or much. So harba, arba here. And it's an ironic echo of be fruitful and multiply here, the greatly increase in number of people, and here instead something else is greatly increasing. And this is where everything turns on, ironically, even one letter. So let's look at it up close here in verse 16, in the Hebrew here. So here we see this, multiply your sorrows and your conceptions. And what's at issue is should this be in or something else? Carol Myers notes it as two things, but other people might see it differently. And so for people who see it in the traditional way, including wonderful scholars like Carol Newsom, we end up with these kinds of interpretations, including also well, I'll go back to Rashi in a second. So from Carol Newsom, we get this. Of all the creatures in the world, only human females have such regularly dangerous and painful birth-giving, and the reason is large heads of human infants. So in other words, she's reading this as the process of giving birth will become painful. But Myers notes that the use of this word here, but all but one use of this word refers to psychological or emotional discomfort, not physical pain, most explicitly in Isaiah 34:6. We won't look at that quite right now. And then she notes that the only other time this word is used is in Genesis 5:29. We'll go to look at that in a second. Myers concludes that the word refers to physical labor rather than an abstract condition of distress, but not ordinary physical labor. The difficulty or distress of agricultural work in an unfriendly environment is indicated. So as we're going to see, she's linking the itzavon here precisely to the itzavon in verse 17 that New Revised Standard translates as toil. The exact same word. So they're both going to have increased itzavon, and her point, Myers' point, is that the word refers to the same thing, hard work, not pain as such. And hard work may be pain, but those are obviously different things. So it all turns on the question of in. Whether it's hendiadys, as we saw earlier in things, like knowledge of good and evil, or other things like that, tohu vabohu, we saw earlier in the very first verses. But Myers says it's not a hendiadys, it's not two words referring to one thing, painful childbearing, but rather pains or toil and childbearing. And what's also confusing is since the word pangs here, itzabon, could be translated as pain, there's a different word for pain here, but etzev, but it's not a far related term. You hear the etzavon and etzev. I don't know if you can see it here in the Hebrew, that it's very close here. You can see that maybe these letters here are similar to these letters here. It's probably hard to see if you can't actually read Hebrew, but there it is. So you'll have increased pains in childbearing and or toil. And now, in something like toil or pain, you shall bring forth children. And Myers' point is we should read this as poetic parallelism. So that this line, I will increase your pains and childbearing, is parallel, including the similar word here, bring forth children. And yet your desire, and this is a challenging thing too, because Teshuk attack here is sexual desire, as we see in Song of Songs 7:11. Here where people are obviously engaged in sexual encounter, and yet we wouldn't think of 4:7 where Cain is confronted about sin as sexual desire. So we'll see there that sin is presented as some kind of erotic force, some kind of thing that will wrap itself around your deepest intimate core. So your desire shall be for your man, in this case, Ish, not Adam, and he shall rule over you. And the challenge here is it rule over or not? And feminist readers can read this one of two ways. They can try to take the word mishal here and suggest that with the preposition that it's connected to, it doesn't mean rule over. Or it can be accepted that patriarchy is part of the curse here. So let's look at a couple of examples. So here we have from Will Gaffney, who is a womanist interpreter. Womanist, if you're not familiar, means an African-American woman who's bringing both feminist and racial observations and experience to her reading. So she notes here, the preposition be, which starts this, means in and or with. If one uses one of the standard lexical tools, one will have to go quite a ways into the entry on the preposition be to find occasions when it is translated over. In and with are its primary meanings. The verse is intelligible with the simple, straightforward primary meaning, he shall rule with you. Others can suggest the same thing. Carol Myers suggests here, except for the imperial domination of David in 2 Samuel 23 and Solomon of 1 Kings, or the eschatological hope for a similar extent of Judean control, the Israelite kings are never said to rule over their people. The verb meshal in its political context seems to refer to an extension of Israelite domination beyond its primary locus, and she gives a couple of examples of that. So there's some questions about the extent of what mashal means as rule. And note that it's a very different word than rule that we saw in chapter 1. Here, it was used in chapter 1, but for ruling over the day and the night, not the word used a little farther down here for having dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and all the animals of the earth, which is rada. So a very different word there than we see in Genesis 3:16. So, some real questions there about whether this is an acknowledgement, yes, patriarchy is a function of the curse, not God's original intention, but a function of the curse, or whether this could be read differently. I'd like to suggest that it seems to me that patriarchy is the outcome here, because everything about this scene is that the egalitarian relationships between the man and the woman have been broken up. The very language of moving from Isha and Isha to sometimes Adam and Isha, and sometimes Ish is highlighting that this unity is split up, as we saw in their each speaking individually and blaming each other in the previous scene. But you can decide for yourself. So that's the expression to the woman. And before we look at the whole thing, we have to see to the man to see how they're exactly parallel. So here it is to the Adam. So notice here to the woman, it was to the Isha, and here's the Adam, highlighting they no longer have linguistic parallel as Ish and Isha, or man and woman. The English implies that, but the Hebrew does not. And so the man is told ahead of time, unlike the woman, 2 reasons for why he's going to be cursed. In fact, he's not going to be cursed. The ground is going to be cursed. Isn't that a curious response? And let's look at the 2 reasons, which might not be what we would expect exactly. To the man, he said, because you've listened to the voice of your wife. Should men not listen to the voice of their wives or women? We'll see here exactly what Abram does with Sarai here in chapter 16. And Sarai said to Abram, you see that Yahweh has prevented me from bearing children. Go to my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Exactly the same phrase. Was it a bad thing there? Well, maybe. Don't tell Ishmael that, or there'd never been an Ishmael. But it certainly created problems in their family, as we see when we'll get there. So the first thing is you shouldn't have listened to the voice of your woman. Should you only be listening to the voice of God? We have no reason to think, especially before the curse, there was anything threatening or suspicious about the voice of his woman. But this, ought to send shivers down us to say you shouldn't be listening to your spouse. And also, you've eaten of the tree about which I commanded you. You shall not eat of it. This is the second time we're not hearing God name the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but simply the tree about which I commanded you. It's a circumlocution that's really curious, given that the knowledge of good and evil is an important part of what's going on here. But the second time, it's simply about the prohibition. So instead of the Adam being cursed, cursed is the ground because of you. The Adamah is cursed because of the Adamah. And here's the matching verb, itzavon. So in toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. So while the woman is having toil and childbirth, the man is having toil in relation to the Adamah, which will bring forth weeds, here described as thorns and thistles, used elsewhere for that same idea. Plants that are not edible and they get in the way and are actually painful. Obviously, thorns can get in your fingers and your toes and everything else. So rather than healthy, good food that God provided for free just to pick, now you're going to fight with the earth and get thorns and thistles and eat the plants of the field, which is an explicit reference to agricultural crops here. The Hasadev we saw earlier in verse 5 of chapter 2 as being the animals of the field, or there are as yet no plants of the field. Now there will be plants of the field. And I think we'll try to squeeze this in, even though I know I'm going longer than I otherwise would, because I can't really stop in the middle of this here. So we see the second half of this, of the man, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. And a couple really important things here. By the sweat of your face is the only time that the word for sweat here is used in the entire Hebrew Scripture. And the word for face here is not the common word for face, pane, but the word for nostrils. Which is what Yahweh blew into the Ruach, the breath of God, in order to animate the Adamah into being an Adam, by blowing in its nostrils. So here, ironically, the place of encounter with God's Spirit now becomes the place of exit, of bodily moisture back into the dry soil. So the Adam will produce moisture to go out of the nose that will go back into the ground. And rather than eating things from the earth, they'll eat bread, which obviously is not something that comes from the earth, but is a function of grassy plants being transformed with much labor into bread. And that might be fun for folks in a pandemic to get out your bread maker or things, but if you're doing it every day for your living, it's hard work, especially without a bread maker. And you'll return to the ground. The word word for return here, shub, is used many times in Genesis, twice in this verse here, and we see here 68 times, usually for the place of return after a journey. So highlighting the parallelism of the journey. You came out of the Adamah and you'll return to the Adamah, used, of course, in Christian circles on Ash Wednesday as a reminder of our mortality. But more is being said here than the simple fact of mortality. It's that the futility of the life that humans are choosing in replacement of the gift of life that they were given. So almost done here. So a couple more important things to see at the end. After all these powerful words from God, there's no response from the humans. There's no, wait a minute, this isn't fair, which we'll hear from Cain in the next chapter, where he whines mightily about his punishment. But none of them, the serpent, nor the woman, nor the man, have any words of response here at all. And there are no other spoken words from the Adam at all. The narrator takes over the task here by putting the man's words in indirect speech rather than direct speech. And the man named or called, as Yahweh God called the Adam at the beginning of this section here, expressing the first thing the Adam does is exercise patriarchy. As this author notes here, the naming of his wife shows he is more willing to conform to the divine words of curse, your husband shall rule over you, than he was to the original command not to eat from the tree. And then he names her Hava, because she was the mother of all living. And there's some wonderful things going on here. As Judith Antonelli notes, the name Hava, with the Het, Vav, and He, contains in it the latter half of the name of God, the Vav and the He, while the man's name, as we've seen, remains linked to the earth, Adam and Adamah. This indicates a higher level of godness in the woman that is not found in the man, which is a curious way to look at that. Let's look at it directly here in verse 20 so we can see it for ourselves. So here's Hava, and here's Yahweh. And so if you look at those closely, you can see that those look very similar. And so this is, we saw that the Hava was what the Adam became, a Hava Nefesh, an Eve woman, and now she's named Eve because she's the mother of all the living. And that's the first time there's an actual mother in Genesis, as opposed to the parallel that we saw in the structural element of this here, where there was the question of women as wife and mothers. Man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. And then finally, after the only response from the humans is the naming here, and she has no response at all, then God responds again. No sense of God's emotion here, and Yahweh has many emotions, and we'll see those many times in the coming chapters. No emotion here, but instead Yahweh God made garments of skin for the man and his woman, for the Adam and his Isha, and clothed them. And one has to wonder, did animals have to die to produce those skins? That's a couple things that are going on here. This is the first making since the original making, and is it for what purpose? They already have fig leaves. It doesn't say they're cold. Is it for protection? The word Kutanoth here is only used a couple more times, and it refers to Joseph's cloak that Jacob gave him. So God and Jacob will be parallel in producing special clothes for people. We'll see when we get to chapter 37 the problem of that there. And then clothe them. And the question is, as Wenham says, is this for protection and disguise? Does it separate them from other animals, or does it separate them from each other as being the only clothed creatures? So that was a lot, and I know I've gone on longer than probably your attention span can allow. But we'll pick up next time by looking at how all these details of the interpretation allow us to see this story as a powerful counter story to both the claim in 1 Kings that Solomon has divine authority with the knowledge of good and evil, and the Babylonian claim for the new Milesh. Stay tuned for that next time. Bye-bye.